Good afternoon. I am pleased to welcome Professor Kawal Rhode today for a talk about the 3D printing in healthcare. Professor Kawal Rhode is a professor in biomedical engineering and the head of education at the School of Biomedical Engineering and Imaging Sciences in King's College, London. So please welcome 3D printing in healthcare by Professor Kawal Rhode. And I will now give the stage to our professor. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Liana, for that lovely introduction. So I'll just go ahead and share my screen. So I'd like to thank the organizers for this invite to give me an opportunity to talk about a topic that I'm very interested in and have been for the past few years, which is the use of 3D printing to support our healthcare provision and healthcare systems. I'm particularly interested in its uses in surgery and interventions, and so I'll be talking mainly about the experience that I have gained over the recent years in this area. So as Liana says, I'm a professor of biomedical engineering at King's College Hospital in London, and I work in the School of Biomedical Engineering and Imaging Sciences. As well as the university, we have our affiliated hospitals, Guy's and St Thomas's hospitals and King's College Hospital, and together we form an entity called King's Health Partners. I'm actually based at St Thomas's Hospital, which is just across the river from the Houses of Parliament in the centre of London. KHP have been pioneering the use of 3D printing for healthcare applications for many years. I think it's been some 10 years that we've been working on applications related to 3D printing or additive manufacturing, as it's more formally called. And we are having a lot of dedicated printing facilities within our various campuses and at our hospitals to help in a number of different areas. So there are printers that are used which are for clinical applications, mainly being used in the routine care of patients. And then we have numerous printers that are used for research, particularly in the areas related to medical device design, development and testing, validation, etc. And the devices themselves can sometimes be constructed using the 3D printing technology, or we could be constructing anthropomorphic phantoms, which could be used, for example, for testing of medical devices. Also, we have research going on related to implants. Another area that we're using additive manufacturing for is for education. And I think it's important so that we empower the future healthcare workforce, that we teach about additive manufacturing. And therefore, we're delivering modules on this topic to students from on a number of different courses, including engineering courses, and also our students on our healthcare courses, so biosciences, medicine, and other courses in the Faculty of Life Sciences. One of the interesting things which happened quite early on at the Guy's and St Thomas's NHS Trust was the procurement of a 3D printer dedicated for doing clinical service delivery in terms of adding in additive manufacturing in routine clinical care. And this printer is managed by our medical physics department, and it's just seen as a service. So various clinical specialities can send in requests for printing, and the printing can be then used in the patient care pathway. So I'll be showing you some examples of that shortly. Now, in terms of how does 3D printing work and what do we need to actually make a 3D print? Well, if you're new to this, then it can seem a little bit overwhelming, but actually it is quite straightforward. So you need to start off with a source of data, and this can be typically coming from one of three things. For medical applications, those data tend to come from imaging systems, so CT, MRI, ultrasound, scanners, for example, and other ways of getting data to carry out 3D printing is, for example, from surface scanners. These are often handheld devices that can be moved in the proximity of an object that you would like to create a 3D model of. Yeah, you just wave them around and then you end up with a computer 3D model file. Also, we can design objects, of course, de novo using computer-aided design or CAD software. One interesting thing, if we're trying to create models of anatomy or of the human being, the medical imaging is very powerful because, of course, not only can you capture the exterior sort of structure of the human, but you can also capture the interior structure as well. And of course, that's not really possible with something like a surface scanner where you're just getting the outside structure. All three of these data sources will yield you a 3D computer model. And these models are typically meshes, surface meshes describing the shape of an object. The mesh itself is made of many tessellated triangles, which form the surfaces of the object that you have captured via the data sources. Typically, this file comes in a file format called STL, or stereolithography file. So that's a common 3D mesh file format. So here's actually an STL file, a model of actually myself, my face, and that was acquired with a surface scanner. Unfortunately, these STL files or 3D computer model files are not recognized by a 3D printer. So it's not, you can't just send this file to the printer in order to get a 3D print. What you need to do is to convert this file into a series of commands which the 3D printer will recognize. And 3D printers use a language or recognize a language called G-code. So G-code is a scripting language which has been used for many years in the sort of domain of computer numerical control manufacturing, or CNC manufacturing. And the G-code is simply a script that tells the printer the sequence in which to perform certain operations. For example, there could be a command that tells the printer to move its nozzle by a certain number of millimeters in a particular direction, or tells the printer to heat the nozzle up to a certain temperature, and so forth. So the G-code is this scripting language. And in order to convert the 3D model file into the G-code file, we need a piece of software called a slicer. And these slicers take in the STL file, allow you to interact with that file and adjust parameters of the 3D print and then generate the G-code. And it's the G-code file that then gets sent to the printer, which will then create your 3D object. Printers themselves come in a number of different flavors, each using a different type of technology. There are about 10 common types of different 3D printing technology currently available. One of the most common is the technology called fusion or fused deposition modeling. Another example is vat polymerization or resin printing. And one more is stereolithography SLS, which is selective layer syndrome. They all slightly work in different ways, but the commonality is that a 3D printer builds up a 3D structure by laying down material one layer at a time. So it's a little bit similar in the way in which maybe you would build a building. Maybe we can talk about the pyramids, for example. You know, you laid down the first layer of blocks and then the next layer on top and so forth, or a Lego house or something like this. It's quite an intuitive way of constructing things in 3D. And that's how printers work. The different technologies are more about the detail and the way in which those layers of material are actually laid down. An FDM printer, this fused deposition modeling type, it takes the material as a filament and then it passes it or pushes it through a hot nozzle. The filament then melts, turns into a liquid, and is extruded out through the nozzle. And at the same time, the nozzle is being moved by the printer gantry in order to get a controlled deposition of the layer. And then as the filament comes out, it rapidly cools from liquid back to solid, and then the whole gantry moves up one layer, and the whole process repeats until you have created your three-dimensional model. So these little boats are a sort of example of things that have been 3D printed on an FDM printer. In fact, these boats are given a special name. They're called benchy, and they're like a test object that you print to check that your printer is working correctly. On a document printer, if you're using an operating system, normally you print a test page to see if all the printer was working correctly. In a 3D printer, you print benchy to look at the benchy print to check that the printer is working well. This benchy has been designed in a very particular way so that you can actually work out the different faults that could possibly be existing with your printer by looking at the features of this 3D printed benchy. So I'm going to go through some examples of how we use 3D printing at King's College, at King's Health Partners. And I'll start off with probably the most long-standing example that we have, something we've probably been doing for about 10 years, is actually helping our pediatric cardiologists. So this is one of my former colleagues, Tariq Hussain, who's a pediatric cardiologist. He works with children who have congenital heart disease. Their hearts are usually quite complex in shape and highly variable. They can be very far from the standard cardiac morphology, and typically these patients need a series of interventions or procedures to help them to stay healthy and to lead normal lives. And what we have been doing for many years at Guy's and St. Thomas's is taking the MRI scans of these patients and then processing them to yield the anatomical models, and then putting those anatomical models through the 3D printing process to create physical models of these children's hearts. And so you can see here one of my colleagues is holding such a print. And so Tarek would do the MRI scan, and he would pass it to the medical physics department. And this is Nick Bone, who's one of our medical physicists who looks after our 3D printer at St. Thomas's. And then Nick would actually then process it into the physical print. This print can then go to the surgical planning meeting, where they can use the healthcare team looking after that patient can use this print to decide what are the best next steps. It seems like a really obvious thing to do, but actually, does it actually make a difference to the care of these patients? One of my colleagues here, Dr. Valverde, did a multi-center study some years ago, which was published in the European Journal of Cardiothoracic Surgery, and they enrolled 10 international centers and then looked at 40 patients that went through this process, and then looked at whether these models actually made a difference to the decision-making process as to what will happen with these patients. So in 19 out of 40 cases, the models helped to refine the surgical approach. So the models actually made a difference to the decisions that were made for that particular patient. And in 21 out of 40 cases, they didn't modify the approach. So that's roughly in half of these cases, these models are actually making a difference as to what you would have done if you didn't have the models, if you had just looked at maybe the scan data on a typical radiology viewing workstation. And so that there is a benefit of using this type of workflow for such patients. And actually, since the time of publication of this study, many others have been done, not only in the domain of pediatric cardiology, but many other types of clinical speciality. And this type of use of 3D printing just to make anatomical models which are patient-specific and then use them at planning meetings, this is well established and is often just part of the routine workflow for particular types of patients. And certainly that is the case for us at St. Thomas's for our pediatric cardiology patients. Now, another area which I mentioned before is using additive manufacturing to actually help us to make medical devices. Now, in terms of a manufacturing process, additive manufacturing is called additive manufacturing because you are basically building something by adding material as opposed to subtractive manufacturing. For example, something like milling or a lathe, this would be a subtractive process. You start off with a block of material, then you remove material from that block to create your final object. Additive manufacturing has this advantage in that it is generally will have less waste material, but also the fact that the technology now is so widely available and so easy to use, and so low cost. The cost is ranging from less than £100 for a printer, but of course there are more expensive ones as well, costing many tens of thousands of pounds or more. But it means the technology is so accessible and manufacturing costs are so low that the development cycle for anything made with additive manufacturing is very short and low cost. That means you can do complex things very, very in a timely way. So something that would have taken you maybe months, years, or even longer via other types of manufacturing, you can do in a much, much shorter time using additive manufacturing. So these are some examples of things we've made over the years using 3D printing. So I'll start off with this one in the middle. This is a catheter that we made, which is steerable, designed for cardiac interventions. And it is made of tiny helical components that all interdigitate to make the final distal part of this catheter. These were all entirely 3D printed, and we were able to basically test our design of this device in a very, very short time frame and at very low cost. Just to give you an idea of scale, the diameter of this is something between 1 and 2 millimeters. So you can print things that are quite small and intricate and functional. Another example are robots for doing things like ultrasound scanning. So here in the left, we see an ultrasound scanning robot. It's a dual arm robot made for fetal scanning. Most of the components here are all designed in CAD and then manufactured using 3D printing. The design of this end piece for this ultrasound robot is highly complex, and if we had made this using traditional milling and drilling and everything else, it would have taken us way too long. We wouldn't have achieved it within the time that we had for this project, and it's only because of additive manufacturing that we could do it. Because if we made a design that wasn't quite right, we were able to iterate very, very quickly to refine the design. This is another example of a ultrasound robot, this time an intra-body ultrasound system designed for cardiac imaging. Again, all the key components here, which were controlling this transesophageal ultrasound probe, all designed and then manufactured using additive manufacturing. This robot actually is the part of this system. It's the control part. So there are 4 linear steppers here that are actuating tendons, which actually go inside to drive this the distal part of this catheter to allow it to move in the way it does. You can not only print with rigid materials with 3D printing, but you can also print things with soft materials as well. And this is an example of an ultrasound robot that we manufactured, again, using 3D printing. Parts of this are rigid, but the actuators here are soft, and 3D printing helped us to manufacture these soft actuators. In fact, additive manufacturing, one of its great uses in robotics is for soft robots, which are actually currently very much in vogue. I've got pictures of my colleagues, my students and researchers that have been involved in all of this work, just to acknowledge their contributions. So one of the areas that I'm really interested in is using printing to make anthropomorphic phantoms, so really high fidelity models of human anatomy, not only being anatomically correct, but also can we try to make them physiologically correct as well, so make them also functional. And we can use these phantoms, for example, for testing medical devices that we're developing. So actually, the things I showed on the previous slide, like the catheters, the ultrasound robots, for example, we could make a model of a part of the cardiovascular system to test the catheter. We could make a model of the pregnant abdomen, for example, to test the fetal ultrasound robot, or a model of the heart to test the intra-body or transesophageal ultrasound robot. We can also use these models to generate or test medical imaging technologies as well, because if the models are compatible with imaging modalities, then we can use them to test developments in those modalities. And more recently, one of the things that we need data, particularly imaging data, to train AI algorithms. And it could well be that if you have a very realistic anthropomorphic model, you can actually image it in a way that you would be imaging humans, volunteers, or actually patients. And you can maybe just image the model to generate the data you need to train an AI algorithm. Another area that's really important is for training of healthcare professionals, particularly my sort of research area, which is in the surgical and interventional domain. We can use these models for training of the professionals to upskill them on complex procedures. Last on the list is another area that we look at is we develop computational algorithms that simulate the physiology of human organ systems, for example, the cardiovascular system. And we want a way of validating these simulations. Of course, we can do the simulations based on patient data, but it's very hard to validate accurately against patient data when you don't have so much control over that physiological environment. So one way is to create an accurate anatomical, but also physiological model of that part of the anatomy, and then to be able to make lots of measurements that will help you to validate your biophysical models or simulations. One of the great advantages of these types of models is that, of course, they're going to reduce the need for patient data. They will reduce the need for animal experiments, because if our models are high fidelity, we don't have to use animals for sure, and also reduce the need for cadaver work as well. And at the same time, because of this, the manufacturing of them is low cost, but also if they're replacing other types of experiments, such as animal or cadaver experiments, they actually reduce the cost of the entire research. So I think these phantoms can be very impactful for research already and in the near future. So this is an example of one such phantom. So this is the work of my PhD student, Xu Wang. This is a model of the complete heart, along with most of the great vessels, and in fact, a large part of the aorta. And what you can see is Xu's just pressing her thumb into this model, and you can see that this material is a soft material. So it's meant to be tissue mimicking in its elasticity, I guess, or its rigidity. But what we want additionally is we want to be able to print in materials that are also, they image well, so they will appear realistic in the common imaging modalities. So this is an example of the material Tango Plus, which is one of these flexible materials, but it is quite a high cost material. And this heart, we printed it on our medical physics printer, costing £750 to print. Now, if you were going to use this as a disposable item, this might be quite costly. So what Xu did was to investigate how we could build complete heart models using other materials at a much lower cost. So she investigated a new series of materials called in a series called the Layform series, and she used the Layform printing with a very low cost extrusion printer and managed to print an entire heart costing only £30. So that's a substantial decrease on using materials like Tango, for example. The data for these models, of course, comes from patient scans, which we take and we segment, and you can see that process here. Segmentation is the process of labeling the data to categorize it into different anatomical structures. The next slide here shows the imaging of such phantoms. And actually, this is probably the one that really is exciting here. This is an echo image of those phantoms. They'll put the phantoms inside a water bath and image them here. This is the one made from Tango Plus, the more expensive material. And here's the one made from Layform 40. Now, if you weren't a sonographer, you would be probably hard pushed to say if this was taken from a human being or from a phantom. I guess you have to be familiar with ultrasound to a reasonable extent. to see the differences. But the amount of mimicry that the model has in terms of its ultrasound appearance is quite substantial. So we managed to get the material tuned up so that it had the right sort of acoustic properties to give us a nice ultrasound image. As well as being imaged in ultrasound, we can image it with CT, we can image it with MR and fluoroscopy. And again, the appearances are reasonable in that we could be using these models for doing testing of devices or imaging systems or a combination of both. As I said, it's one thing to make an anatomically correct model that even has realistic sort of imaging properties, but trying to make functional models is one step forward. And that's something that we have had a go at doing, particularly as this slide illustrates, making models of cardiac valves that actually work and behave like real valves of our heart. The aim here wasn't to make these valves so that they could be implanted, but to make the valves so that we could accurately validate computational algorithms that help us to understand blood flow in diseased valves. So these valves we made using silicone, and silicone is exceptionally good material at mimicking tissue properties, but it is not easy to directly print in silicone. I'll come on to tell you about that in the next slide. So the way to make these valves is using a two-part mold technique. So what we did, we took CT scans from patients, we segmented out the cardiac valves, and using computer-aided design software, we design a two-part mold, which when clamped together, as you can see here, so this is the two-part mold, the outer part, the inner part, we clamp that together. The outer part, we print it in a rigid plastic, and the inner part, we print it in a dissolvable material, such as PVA. So PVA is the white glue that we use often to stick paper and card, and it can come as a filament and be printed. So here we see the mold, inner and outer parts clamped together, and then we insert silicone, which goes in between the inner and outer part, and then we allow the silicone to set, and afterwards we unclamp it, and out pops our aortic root model. So this is the aortic root with the valve right there. We then can modify this print to actually simulate some common valve pathologies. So here we just have a normal valve, and then different types of common valve diseases we can simulate by modifications of that model. We can then put that into a flow rig. So we have some tubing that's connected to a pulsatile pump. We have many points at which we can monitor things like pressure and flow in this circuit. And this is a great way of trying to simulate accurately flow across the aortic valve, and to measure it and actually use those measurements to help us to see if our computational models of that flow are correct. This valve, because it's made of silicone, it images very well. We can image it with ultrasound. It has a realistic appearance in ultrasound. We can also image it with numerous types of MR protocol as well. It has quite a realistic appearance in MR too. Making valves or functional models using a two-part technique is quite time-consuming. And one of the things that we did was try to build our own 3D printer that could directly extrude silicone. So you can see this printer coming off, printing here. just printing a simple cylinder. What happens is that silicone comes into it in two parts, the part A and part B, and when they mix, then the silicone is cross-linked and then starts to harden over time. So this design actually was something that was already in the literature, which we then took as a starting point and modified that to get our own version working here. Now, beautifully, we managed to actually use this silicone printer to actually print ourselves some valves. So you can see, in fact, this is one of my undergrad students, Zhang Chongbu, and he's just holding this 3D printed valve, which we then put in an outer ring of rigid plastic. And we can see here on the left the molded valve that we made using the techniques mentioned in the previous slide, and now this 3D printed one. And actually, this is a nice B-mode image of that valve actually in the flow rig and being imaged during pulsatile flow. And you can see nicely the leaflets of that valve opening and closing. And we take this up to physiological pressures, and it behaves in a way similar to a native aortic valve, which is very nice. And this was directly 3D printed. So some of my students are now carrying on with this project to try to build the printers so that can print more complex structures directly in silicone. It's quite challenging, but you can also now buy commercial printers that will print in silicone. It's one of the big areas right now that's happening in 3D printing. So going on to this idea of using 3D printed phantoms for training of healthcare professionals, particularly surgeons and interventionalists. So this is the work of one of my PhD students, Antonia Pontiki, and she was working with the thoracic surgeons at Guy's, and they do a lot of minimally invasive or minimal access surgery to remove lung cancer. And doing this minimally invasive surgery requires a lot of training, and there isn't really a very good training model for that type of surgery. So Antonia worked with the surgeons to actually design a half chest model. So we managed to do the ribs, the ribs are printed, the skin is sheet silicone, and then making the lungs using a mold technique. So we print the lungs negative model using the printer, and then use a expanding foam-like material to make the lungs. And the heart is printed in on our medical physics printer, a material called Agilis, and so forth. So here, what's elegant is that we've used a number of different techniques, all related to 3D printing, to make a complex model, which its purpose is to be highly realistic and to simulate the minimal invasive surgical procedure for lung lobectomy. We actually worked with Medtronic, who supply a lot of the instrumentation for these procedures, to host a training session for the surgeons using these models and to evaluate these models. And we did this just before the lockdown, and the results were very encouraging in that these models were felt to be of reasonably high fidelity. There were some improvements that were needed. For example, we needed to make them compatible with the diathermy instruments and so forth, which we've now gone and done as well to simulate, so we can simulate the cutting of tissue and so forth. And really, here we're not presenting an alternative to something which is actually presenting a new way of training surgeons for this type of procedure. And we're yet to evaluate this in a significant study, but the results from our initial study with Medtronic have been really encouraging and exciting. And so we continue to develop this model currently. This is another model that one of my other students, William Crinion, he's a neuroradiologist and works does the neuroradiology procedures like thrombectomy and aneurysm coiling, cerebral aneurysm coiling, and so forth. And the team that has Will, which Will is in, they basically are developing a robot that will do guide wire manipulation in the circle of Willis. And what we needed was a model of the circle of Willis that we could use to validate or test the robot. And so Will created this very, very simple and low cost and yet very effective model of the circle of Willis. Again, we started off with some patient data from which we segmented out the cerebral vasculature, and then we used that to create basically a negative inside a block of material, which we hooked up using valves and tubing. And we're able to basically pump this model also to introduce contrast agent. And its appearance in fluoroscopy is very interesting. If we look at the fluoroscopic images here, they actually are very realistic, and its appearance is very much like if you were doing fluoroscopy and the angiography in the neurovasculature. So it gives a very realistic appearance, and as a first order approximation to that complex anatomical situation, it's a great starting point. Finally, moving on to how we can help with replacing some anatomical components during surgery. So that's quite a challenging thing to be doing, sort of 3D printing for implants, but it's actually done for a number of different applications. For example, a lot of max-fac surgery uses direct printing of parts using materials like acrylic-like materials or using titanium, for example. You can get printers that print in metal. What we wanted to investigate, again, my student Antonio Pontichi, was how could we actually help our thoracic surgeons to do chest wall repair, but in a very, very cost-neutral or exceptionally economical way, because patients who have bone involvement in lung cancer, they have to have the bones removed. So often ribs or even sternum and so forth. And how do you repair that, or how do you replace it? Well, there are a number of methods, but either they're not very satisfactory in terms of their sort of physiological and aesthetic outcome, or they're super expensive, like using titanium replacements. So what we did was we came up with a very simple workflow for helping our surgeons and, of course, helping these patients. So we would take the CT scans from these patients, segment out the bones that were to be removed, and then print the bones in a very low-cost plastic, literally costing some pennies. We then use these to create a mold in silicone, and we send the silicone mold for sterilization via autoclaving. It then goes to theater, and when the patient comes in for their surgery, they use that mold to create the ribs using bone cement. So that's already, that's an acrylic analog polymethyl methacrylate. It's already an approved material for implantation. And that's what orthopedic surgeons use for bone repair. So they pour the material into the mold, they create the ribs, which are effectively customized for that patient because they came off that patient's pre-op scan, and then they use that model to replace whatever was removed. And it's a very simple but elegant workflow. And we've done in the order of about 15 patients so far. And the results are aesthetically, the results are very good compared to some of the other repair methods that are traditionally used. And also, really importantly, the lung mechanics are very much preserved in these patients by this type of repair. So that's something we've measured, and actually just recently had a paper printed in the Annals of Thoracic Surgery detailing all of those results. So I've just given you some examples of what we're using 3D printing for. Of course, there are many other areas. There are the whole tissue engineering side of things, making scaffolds, using bioink to print cell layers and so forth. That's not something I particularly work with, but there are many colleagues that do work in that domain as well at King's and at other universities. In a nutshell, I mean, the whole printing thing is really like a revolution. It's a technological revolution. Just like we have sort of the computing revolution, we've got this 3D printing revolution going on. And I think it's going to be very transformative. We've already seen how it's transforming the way in which we do research, and even in the last slides, how it's actually changing the way in which we manage our first and last slides, how we manage our patients as well. So I think for me, I think its impact is going to be in training of medical professionals and also helping us to develop medical devices in a much more efficient way. And of course, all of these will go to improving patient care. And really importantly, I think we can reduce the reliance on animals and cadavers, for example, for many types of research that we carry out by using 3D printing. Thank you for your attention. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Professor. We have a question, actually. Banu asks, which kind of 3D printers are usable for cardiac replicas, FDM or SLA?
Yeah, so you can use all of these types, but there's going to be pros and cons. I mean, the one we are using to print in the material Tango Plus, that's a polyjet, so ink is a jetting technology. But Shu was using an FDM printer to print in lay form. There's pros and cons. It depends what you want to do. I mean, some of the issues related to 3D printing are things like delamination, like the layers coming apart. So if you're like if you need something to be mechanically integral, you may want to maybe go for an approach other than, for example, FDM, where delamination can be quite a serious problem. So, and then the costs are going to be different as well. If you were to, now you can get for vat polymerization or resin printers, you can get resins that will also give you flexible prints. But there's issues in terms of, I mean, we certainly don't have a resin printer that can print at cardiac scale. We only have small footprint, small build volume resin printers, because if you want to get one that with a bigger build volume, it'll actually, it can be quite pricey actually. So I think it's interesting. 3D printing is interesting because actually, even before you like make anything, you have to, it's the whole, you have to think about the whole process. You have to think about, what do I want this object for? And then you can work out how best to design it for which printing technology so that it fulfills its purpose. So you really need to see it end to end, as it were. You can't just start designing something or have a model and say, can you please print this? I mean, it's best to think about the process for all the way through, because if you're designing things, how you design them will affect how they can be printed as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Banu wants to ask another question.
Sure.
Please, Banu.
Hi, Kawal. It's Banu
Hello.
from Istanbul.
Yes.
Undoubtedly, modeling gives great results in biomedical engineering and in many fields. And as you said, that it's limited with our imagination. We can create anything we want. I really wonder about your research lab issues. You showed some photos from your lab, from your students' works, and I was very curious about that circle of Willis study. You showed that an X-ray image and a contrast agent was flowing through the printed parts. Now, what we were looking for there, I missed the points that I wanted to ask.
Yeah, we built that model to test a guide wire robot. So we're making ourselves a robot that manipulates guide wires in the circle of Willis. And this was a way in order to test that robot. So traditionally, how would you do it? You would probably go to a company that supplies anatomical models and buy a silicone model of the circle of Willis. I mean, I can give you an example, a silicone model of circle of Willis from a company that does models would probably cost you in the region of £400 to £500. So we just made a model that cost 4 to 5 pence, literally. So it's like, and the beauty is that if you want to have 10 models with different geometries so that you can test your device in 10 different anatomical sort of topologies, as it were, that's fine. You're not going to be limited because it's so low cost, isn't it? Right? Or you could, even design these models yourself, putting in pathologies into normal human anatomy and so forth. So I think it's this whole ability to create stuff that you're in control of, and that is so low cost, and that means everything is so accessible, and that means your whole research cycle is so much reduced. And also the money that you're getting for research, if it's coming from whatever funding, you just put it to better use, isn't it, right?
Yeah, this is an important point, grant issues and funding. And there was one more study you did, a kind of molded sternum, just PMMA material. And this was a custom implant just needed by using reverse engineering method maybe. And is there any standards for custom implants? You create something and they implant to the patient. Is there any standard? If it is patient specific, is it okay? Or do we need some rules, standards like ISO medical device standards?
Yeah, that's interesting. So that study, which actually, of course, is a clinical study, was authorized by our NHS trust as a under local approval, because it was felt that we weren't altering substantially the routine workflow. So the normal workflow for patients, say, having bone replacement after chest wall surgery is like the surgeons, what they do is they get the PMMA and they freehand mold it into something that looks like a rib or something that looks like a sternum. What we were doing is just providing them a mold that was had been created from the patient's pre-op scans. And therefore, in terms of like, and we did have to undergo a few obvious health and safety or sort of control procedures. One of them was looking at the sterilization of the mold and making sure that that was correct, and also the microscopic properties of the mold to make sure that there was nothing on that mold other than silicone, for example. And silicone itself is a material that's quite approved in medtech as well. So that study was handled through local approval in the trust. It was not needing to have to go through, because we weren't putting inside of the patient's body any material that was not already approved for implant, because PMMA is approved.
Great,
but now what we're trying to do is we're trying to 3D print the implants directly. We made a new printer that can directly print in a material like PMMA. In fact, it's called PEEK, polyether ethyl ether ketone, something like this. That material too is approved for implants, believe it or not. But when you 3D print it, it's not approved. So we are basically working out a workflow where we can directly print those implants and sterilize the material and go through the whole approval process. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much, Banu. And once again, I would like to thank in the name of EIT Health Alumni and Clinician Engineer Hub for your presence and for your great talk. It's really great what you can do with just a 3D printer. I hope to see you soon in another webinar. And thank you very much and goodbye.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for listening.